Okay, so welcome to the show, Ruth. It's great to have you here, particularly as we head into the election year. Your book, Strongmen, Mussolini to the Present, is essential reading now. So I've heard you say that Trump is a master propagandist and authoritarian leader. What, in your opinion, are the traits that make up a successful, or I should say a successful strongman?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I'm so glad to be speaking with you about this. I wish my book were irrelevant, but sadly, it is not. And I had to put up a bit of a struggle to include Trump in the book. And of course, I'm very glad I did. So, Trump kind of ticks all the boxes in terms of the type of personality he is, compulsive liar, uses everyone, use and discard philosophy about people, obsessed with having power, and, obsessed with his own victimhood. And the whole, since 2016, I've been trying to get Americans to shift their frame of reference because they didn't have the kind of framework to see somebody like Trump for what he was. And so the idea that, most politicians who are have legal troubles wouldn't want to run for office because you're under the scrutiny. But strongmen, they're compelled to run for office because they need to get into power or back into power to make their legal troubles go away.
Right.
And so it's, and it's not just Trump, it's, Putin, Berlusconi, Netanyahu, all kinds of people have done this. And so it's a kind of a playbook. And so I've tried to point out that Trump is not unique, but it can happen anywhere to any country. And so Americans have to understand that they're not immune and they can't just ignore this because it's not going away.
Well, it is unique in the United States. I mean, we have not seen the likes of Donald Trump. Something our forefathers were, of course, always concerned of is that there would be an individual who would become president that wants to be more than just the president of the United States, wants to be the dictator, a monarch, a Führer, supreme leader, and that's exactly what Donald wants. And it's a very scary thing for America, and yet he still has this incredible stronghold over a significant portion of this country. Now, I don't agree with a lot of the pundits where they're like, he's got 50% of the country. First of all, the Republican Party is not 50% of the country.
Yeah.
If you want to be really basic, 1/3 of the country is Republican, 1/3 of the country is Democrat, and 1/3 of the country are independents. Democrats are not going to vote for him. There is already a significant portion of Republicans, especially the young, that will not vote for him. And now you have to worry about the independents. That's where I really see us standing right now.
I'm glad you say that because authoritarians do their best to make people think that their victory is inevitable, that their triumph, even whether they're in office or trying to get back to office, that everything they do is going to succeed. And they use their tools of intimidation and threat to silence people. And that way you don't hear the voices of those who say, no, this is not inevitable. They are a minority. And so he's trying to do that. And the news coverage has sometimes not helped because it's not pointing out that they are a minority, that and focusing more on all the independents who can be swayed and how we can sway those people, how we can message those people. Because the more people think that it's inevitable that, in this case, Trump will win, people thought it was inevitable he'd win in 2020, and he didn't. the more that they might give up and be disaffected from politics and turn off. And that's what they want, and that's what democracy depends on them not doing.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this then. What, in your opinion, would happen to the country if Trump were actually to get back into the White House? Do you think that average Americans understand what a Trump dictatorship would mean or look like to the nation?
It's a good question because, one of the reasons I didn't use the word fascist for a very long time, and I still don't use it very often about Trump, is that I felt that people were not prepared to understand what that might mean today. When we see fascist, we think of Adolf Hitler, and yes, now he's talking like Adolf Hitler, but we think of, military coups and tanks on the street and all that. And that's often not how it works today, right? Today, they get so even Putin, he got his power over time. And so it can be hard today where you keep elections going and you have the semblance of democracy, but as in Hungary or Turkey, it doesn't really, or Russia, the leader things are arranged and weighted so that the leader prevails. And it can be hard to know what the tipping point is. So Americans are not, they're not prepared to understand what would happen, or they're going to think that it's not going to be of interest to them. And this is something that I'm going to be stressing during the year 2024, because the Trump campaign's being very open about what they're going to do and who they're going to do it to. And it's a lot of people, right? Judges, prosecutors, people who write about authoritarian now. I was told by Trump's spokesperson, Stephen Chung, that, my existence will be, quote, crushed for calling him out on his, fascist rhetoric. But
it's too bad you don't have that on a recording, because that would be fantastic and it would go viral.
Well, it's in the Washington Post. He said it to the Washington Post. He said, those who make assertions, and he was asked about my comments, will find their entire existence crushed when Trump returns to the White House. So, and this is an example of how they try to get people to shut up out of fear. I'm not going to be shutting up at all, quite the contrary. But, I think that they've been very open about wanting to deport, millions of immigrants or put them in camps, and very disturbing. Trump's talking about psychiatric hospitals. He said Jack Smith should be in a, quote, mental institution. So the average American can think, well, I'm not in those categories. I'm not an immigrant. So it's not going to, nothing's going to happen to me. And that's incorrect because they may start with one category, but sooner or later, they come for other people. And for example, in fascist Italy, the Italian Jews thought, well, Mussolini's not like Hitler. He hasn't come for us. So he's never going to come for us. So we can be fascists. And many Jews were fascists. And then inevitably, he did come for them, and the Holocaust.
And what about the German Jews during the same period? I'm not
exactly.
Jewish. I'm German, right? And how many books have been written by people? Some of whom were 25% Jewish, and it was still pursuant to Hitler's chart. You are then, if you're a quarter Jewish, you're Jewish, and off to the camps you go.
Yeah, and so I think one of the lessons from doing a global book like Strongmen, because it starts with Mussolini and Hitler, it ends with Trump and Putin, is you see these patterns in history. And one of them is that people can be in denial. They really are very invested in thinking that nothing's going to happen to them. Because also, if you realize that, your democracy is at stake and you might be a target, it might mean you have to change your life a little bit and do something about it. And a lot of people don't want to do that. They prefer, maybe they're not political and they want to keep it that way. But that's not the moment we're in now.
I don't blame them. I don't blame them. You may have seen the other day, and there's many articles are written about it, but one in particular, came out from the Daily Beast. The article was written by Jose Pagliari, and it's entitled Trump just officially got away with jailing Michael Cohen in 2020. I don't know if you saw that, and that was based upon the decision that came from the 3-panel judges at the Second Circuit here in New York in regard to my lawsuit against Trump, the United States government, Bill Barr, for an unconstitutional remand. An unconstitutional remand back to prison because I refused to waive my First Amendment constitutional right. So I constantly tell people all the time, wake the fuck up. Clear your eyes with whatever's in it. Open up, if that means going to the ENT doctor and getting your ears flushed so that you can hear exactly what Donald said. Don't take Michael Cohen's word for it. I say this all the time. Don't take Ruth Ben-Ghiat's word for it. Don't take any of the pundits or journalists' word for it. Listen to what Donald is telling you that he is going to do. On day number 1, we've already heard he's got a bunch of things he's planning on doing, including rewriting the Constitution. That in and of itself should disqualify him. And I don't mean disqualify him like the way Maine or Colorado are disqualifying him from the ballot. I'm talking about by American citizens. Rest assured, what the Second Circuit just gave Donald Trump is the ability to jail you, Ruth, if in fact he comes back into power. That they will have people come to your door like the way Stalin did it. They will knock the door down unless you come out willingly. They will bag you, tag you, put you into a truck. And what Donald said he's going to do, he's going to send everybody off to Gitmo. I know it's the one prison that he knows. So he sends you to Alcatraz, to Gitmo. I mean, what kind of what asshole makes a comment like that who happens to also be the leading candidate for one of our 2 political parties? How did something like this even happen?
Yeah, well, he saw there was an opening in 2015 for this kind of politics, and he's been my take on it is he's been educating Americans. This is where the propagandist comes in. He's been educating them to see authoritarian rule and throwing people in prison with, all of that as positive, that it's necessary. Violence is necessary sometimes to save the nation. And, I was really, when I started researching how he was using his rallies to change the way people saw violence, he kept, this is where he's a good propagandist. He throws out these things. It seems to be a joke, but it's not. And he said, the problem is, this is 2016, he said, nobody wants to hurt each other anymore. Or in the old days, you used to beat somebody up. And this was about protesters, right? And now and so 7 years later, he's talking about sending the military, out to shoot protesters. But he's been trying to emotionally retrain Americans so that they don't care about each other. They see him as the God. And they see that kind of rule as positive. And that's why he keeps holding up all these other authoritarians. He never compliments Democrats. He doesn't compliment Macron. He compliments murderous North Korean dictators or Xi Jinping or Putin. And it's interesting. He says he wants to stop the radical left.
The very powerful Viktor Orban. You all know who Viktor Orban is? Viktor Orban, the head of Turkey, and so you're like, wow, it's like,
so
I'm in Hungary,
but it's over and over again. It's over and over hundreds of times in the last 7 years. So that drip, 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 Americans who believe in him have learned that this is a good kind of leadership. And so then, lo and behold, it's the election year, and he comes out with that he wants to be a dictator. And he's prepared people to think dictators are okay. So it's happened people were not noticing that it was happening. And this is unfortunately in history. By the time many people, as you say, wake up and wash their eyes and ears, clear their eyes and ears, it's sometimes too late.
Okay. Except we see on television the various different individuals that have and continue to suffer as a result of authoritarians' abuse of power, like, for example, Navalny, right? I mean, who disappeared and then was now sent up to Siberia into a gulag because that's what Putin decided. You know, one of the things that Jose in the Daily Beast article wrote, and it's just the panel, meaning this 3-judge panel at the Second Circuit here, tacitly acknowledged that something unfair clearly happened. Well, no shit. I was lured down to 500 Pearl Street by Adam Pakula and Enid Phoebus, unconstitutionally remanded, spent another. So the judges noted how the then president's arch enemy, me, was thrown back in prison on flimsy reasoning, and how the case was only resolved through some extraordinary intervention by a judge who eventually ordered that Cohen should be released. Ironically, the judges ruled it was the very intervention that now prevents Cohen from holding Trump and certain government agents accountable, citing a 1971 Supreme Court case called Bivens versus 6 unknown named agents. And then here, while this relief may not have made Cohen whole, this is what they said: when alternative methods of release are available, a Bivens remedy usually is not. Can you imagine this? So what they're saying is that Donald can lock you up simply because he wants to, because he now knows that he has the ability to do so. And your only remedy, the only deterrence that now exists to stop him from doing that to you and to thousands of other people, is by them filling out a writ of habeas corpus, filing it with the court, a federal court, citing Michael Cohen versus USA, Donald Trump, Bill Barr et al., and using that as the precedented case in order to be released. I spent 16 additional days, making it a total of 51 days in solitary confinement, locked away for 23 and a half hours a day in a busted up, broken cell with no ventilation. And it was during the summer. And so the cell became in excess of 100 degrees, with gnats coming in because the window was broken. It was missing a piece of glass. They wouldn't even give me a piece of plastic and some Scotch tape to seal it up. That's what you will be going through. That's what others will be going through. And this panel, despite the fact that they appear to all be Democrats, granted Trump the ability to do this. Because when he first did it to me, just like the January 6th insurrection, you know what those were? They were practice runs. Now he knows exactly what needs to be done in order to achieve what he wants. And that is to be able to, like this guy who threatened you from Trump's campaign, be careful what you do, because there will be repercussions if and when Donald becomes president again. This is what they're going to do. It's exactly what they're going to do.
Yeah, the learning is very important, because, and this is part of what his campaign is releasing, all these plans for, 2025. And it's quite daunting how the Heritage Foundation, there's so many villains. It reminds me of all the people on a much larger scale, all the people in Chile, far-right people, conservative media tycoons, who colluded for years before the coup happened. And the coup was, U.S. backed. But sometimes people think, oh, the U.S. did the coup. It was Chileans who did the coup. The U.S. gave a lot of help. But all these people colluded, planning, and there was a failed coup. Because failed coups are ways that you learn, what you got to do better next time. So this whole Trump 2025 thing, there's 70 organizations under the umbrella of the Heritage Foundation, and they've all been studying what happened under Trump 1.0 and what went wrong. So they didn't get a total, a lot of people in civil service didn't want to obey Trump's illegal things, so they resigned, or there was pushback. So this time, that's why they're trying to have a purge of 50,000 people, so they get all these loyalists in there. And they're being very open about it. And the same with January 6th. It almost worked. It came way closer to working than most Americans know. But, Marjorie Taylor Greene is very open. She went to a gala, black tie, and she's in an elegant gown. And she starts boasting. It was a Young Republicans Club thing. Mm-hmm. And she said, if I had planned the coup, it would have succeeded because there would have been more weapons there. So they're being very open about how they're learning from their I wouldn't even call it failures, just they didn't achieve what they wanted to. And this time they plan to.
Yeah.
So Americans need to know that.
Think of it like a football coach. Sometimes the play just needs an adjustment, and that's what they're doing. Let me ask you this then. Do you think that someone like Nikki Haley would be any better? Because she appears to be as far right as Trump at this point in time. Yeah. DeSantis, we already know, is a Donald Trump 2.0. Yeah. Just like, thank goodness Vivek Ramaswamy is not even going to be on the debate stage in Iowa. I mean, he's just such a moron, with the smiling and the cackling, the yelling. He's trying to be Donald, 2.5, but we haven't even gotten to 2.0 yet. But I see Nikki Haley.
He's such a fanatic.
He's such a fool. I see Nikki Haley and I see DeSantis as Donald 2.0s. What's your thought?
Yeah, it's Nikki Haley's like a lesson, right? That this is somebody who took down the Confederate flag from the South Carolina Capitol in 2015. And now she stood on I will never forget this, Michael. It's like emblazoned in my brain. That debate, the first GOP debate, when all of them but two sat there. These are people running for president against Trump. And they're so far into the cult, and they're so afraid that they humiliated themselves, took all their power away, and raised their hands, all but two, and said they'd support him even if he becomes a convicted felon. And she was one of those. And this just like shows you that there's in my line of study, we call this autocratic capture, when the leader captures, and this is like the guy hasn't even been in power for 2 years, which makes it all the more pathetic. He wasn't even there to look at them and threaten them in person, and they still raised their hands. So she's there's no hope for her. She's willing to, in the new Trump era, you do what you need to do to prevail, and you don't care about morals or ethics, and that's what she's become, it seems.
Well, a lot of this really has to do with their need and their desire to retain their title and their power. That's why you start seeing folks like Ted Cruz, those that chose not to, that were willing to put America, democracy, put the Constitution and their constituents and all of America ahead of their own self-interest. People like Adam Kinzinger, people like Mitt Romney, people like Liz Cheney. Look what happened to them. They got pushed out, right? I mean, because they went against the Fuhrer, and as a direct result, they lost their seats. They're really the true heroes of the Republican Party. But the problem is, heroes that lose are very soon forgotten. And all you get left is with the Ramaswamis, the Boberts, the Marjorie Toilet Greens, right? The Josh Hawleys, the Matt Gaetzes. That's what you get left with. You get left with, I have issues on both sides with the extremists, the far, far right and the far left of the Democratic Party. And here's something that so many people don't know. I've been a Democrat my entire life. I've been a registered Democrat. And yet, people always like, well, you only attack Republicans. You never attack Democrats. That's not really true. There's a series of folks in the Democratic Party who I think are too extreme, and I would like to see them out. I believe in moderates. I believe that to be slightly left of center or slightly right of center is where we used to be as a country, when like Tip O'Neill, right, would be able to have an argument with you on the floor. And then after hours, two of you would go meet for a drink and hash shit out. because there was enough there for the two to come up with some sort of an agreement that is not a win for one side, not a loss for the other. And that's how negotiation works. That's why things were getting done. Right now, it's a winner take all and a loser get nothing scenario. And under that specific, set of ideas, government cannot function.
Yeah, no, what you described is actually, democracy, right? And we are very challenged versus other countries that got into this similar situation because we're only got the two parties. Because in other places, if there's somebody who captures one big party and is too extreme, there's a choice of other parties to go to. Or the other parties, this happened in Italy, there's this total thug, Salvini, far-right guy, really extreme. In 2019, it looked like he might become the prime minister, very dangerous guy, very violent. So all the other parties, even parties that didn't like each other, they got together and they prevented him from coming to power. We can't do that because we only have these two parties. And one of our two parties is now, I see it as an autocratic party. Unfortunately, the GOP, it ticks every single box for an authoritarian party now, including that it's, enthralled to this violent cult leader. And if the GOP had a foreign policy, it would be a foreign policy of an autocracy, not a democracy. And think about, what they're doing with Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So I want to just go back to something we talked about and bring in, for example, the Heritage Foundation and others just like them. They're actually gearing up for a potential Trump victory in 2024. Yeah. And supposedly they have created a day one agenda for the Trump administration to follow. I mean, could you imagine this? The Heritage Foundation. And if you don't know how crazy that these folks are, just take a look to see what happened to Roe versus Wade. They have a day one agenda that they want the Trump administration to follow. How does a Trump dictatorship help these sorts of conservative entities? And more importantly, who actually benefits from it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Because I don't think any of these people, I wouldn't even call them conservatives, because conservatives don't enable or support coups. Once you've had a violent coup attempt, that's not what old-time conservatives do. These people are extremists, and they see that this is their hour. Finally, they're close to getting the kind of power where they can, strip government, they can stop public spending, they can, and who benefits are all the very wealthy people, the billionaires, the Kochs. Because an interesting thing about authoritarianism is we associate it with more controls on people. You're talking about, right, rounding people up, not caring about rule of law. But there's a whole other part of authoritarianism, which is, so some people have more controls on them and they have to shut up. Other people have fewer limits on their activities, and that's rolling back regulations. And Trump already did this the first time in the area of like food safety and in the environment. He rolled back over 100 regulations, making it easier for the environment to be plundered, our food supply, big agriculture, all the bigs. They loved this. And these are also libertarian people, neoliberal people, all of these forces who want fewer regulations. He also, and people forget this, he partly decriminalized domestic violence. So there too, you can plunder bodies, you can plunder the environment. That's part of authoritarianism that we don't hear about enough. So those are all the people who would benefit.
Yeah. So, the funny thing is, these folks, these mega billionaires and all, they all think that they're going to benefit under another Trump administration, as they did the first time, whether it was the theft of PPP money, whether it was the rolling back of these regulations that basically saved them a lot of money in terms of compliance. Not this time. Not this time. You see, I believe that the New York Attorney General case is going to financially slap Donald literally to the ground. I believe that the amount is going to be significantly more than the 250 million baseline that Tish James was calling for. And what is Donald in essence? He's a copycat. What's he going to do? I believe he's going to copy exactly what Mohammed bin Salman did on day number 1 when he entered as deputy crown prince, right? When he became the crown prince. He's going to start rounding them up, the Kochs, the Zuckerbergs, the Elon Musks, the Jeff Bezoses of the world. He will round them up, and he will put them on the floor at Mar-a-Lago, just like Mohammed bin Salman did at the Ritz, and he will have them sign over their wealth to him. And people could roll their eyes and say, it's not possible. You know what else is not possible? Having somebody thrown into prison because you don't like what they're going to say about you. He knows what he can get away with. He knows on day number 1, if he rewrites the Constitution, as he said he will. He also said he's going to strip the judiciary and the legislative branch of their co-equal powers under the tripartite system and confer all power onto the executive branch, meaning to him. He becomes the king. And if the king turns around and says, I'm taking your money, you could either sign it over willingly and I'll let you keep $1 billion, or I take it all and put you on the street, including your houses, your cars, your planes. And you know why he'll do it? Because he can. And that's what this is all about. Not doing shit for America, making America great again.
No,
this is all about making Donald rich again.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not sure he would do it right away, but one thing I've tried to do in my newsletter, the Substack newsletter, LUCID, and it's interesting when I started it 2.5 years ago, and the first article I wrote was about how authoritarians like Putin plunder business, because this is something Americans are not, they're not understanding that when and Erdogan plundered over $32 billion. And everyone's like, oh, Erdogan is a strong ruler. So I think that we need to really reach out to the business community way more than we've been doing. We just, people who care about democracy, and help them understand that almost everywhere authoritarians go, they start to plunder business. Look what DeSantis did in Florida. Who goes after like the Special Olympics and Disney? It's so stupid.
Yeah, well, that's
but they're driven. In his case, DeSantis driven by ideologies, a fanatic. Trump, I agree. He just needs to get his money back, right? He needs to get.
It's going to be more than his money. He wants to be, and he will become, if reelected, the first trillionaire. He will also have the full power of the military. Remember, here's another thing
this is a big problem.
He is going to have every single person that he brings as part of the transition team to government sign a loyalty pledge to him. So you tell the head of the army, well, Ruth is worth $1 billion. I want that $1 billion. Go to her house, grab her, bag her, tag her, and bring her to Mar-a-Lago. You think they're going to say no? I don't.
Yeah, that's another. That is what the military does. Having strongmen is a third of it is military coups. So the theme of authoritarians in the military is everywhere in the book. But I'm really worried about that because we have one of the largest militaries in the world. We're a superpower. We're a nuclear power. And the consequences of having like a counter-revolution where you turn the military on the people. I mean, he tested that out too, as you know, in Lafayette's after, in 2020. Right. And it backfired because General Milley and others who we don't hear about as much are not pro-authoritarian. So there too, he's trying to plan ahead. I'm very worried about that. If you ask me, what are the top three things, that's one of them.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask you this then. Is it safe to say that because the Republican Party has been aligned with Trump and the big lie for so long, that they're no longer in support of the Constitution and our democracy? Is that a fair thing to say?
Unfortunately, yeah. They have exited democracy. And when they talk about the Constitution, there's a whole bunch of people who talk about the Constitution, including these like fraudulent constitutional sheriffs. But they're trying to have the Constitution they have in mind is not a Constitution that protects democracy and civil rights and freedoms. It's a Constitution that is warped to help people like Trump and become lawless. So yeah, we have to get Americans to understand that the Republican Party, the official, all the people who are there in Congress, et cetera, they have exited democracy. They are for autocracy.
Ruth, you
It's
may
very
have heard me
scary
say
for people.
it's very scary, and people better open their ears. And that's why I constantly say, when it comes to this show and to others, subscribe, listen, rate, and share with your friends so that they hear from people who actually know what's really going on. But Ruth, you may have heard me say this several times. If you have a strong America, you have a strong world. If you have a weak America, you will have a weak world. So if countries are made essentially weaker by the chaos of authoritarian rule, why would Republican voters embrace it? I scratch my head whenever I think about that as a question. Why? Why in the world would Republican voters embrace this?
It's because I think they have been brainwashed by Fox. They have been brainwashed by Trump and all of his mini Trumps in Congress. There's a party line. There's been a party line for a very long time, and that's very effective when everybody has to say the same thing, as happened after January 6th. And they've been so effective that now, because the anniversary is coming up, there's news articles and polls. The majority of Republicans don't really think that much happened on January 6th. They just won't. Fox and all of the political allies have been successful in changing the whole narrative of January 6th. So it's the same. They see Trump as they believe it and Fox always has like cities are anarchy and crime and they're creating a fake world over and over again for years. And so people see this and they think, oh, I alone can fix it. We need the strongman to fix it. And they truly believe this. And that's what's so scary. We have to reach those people. And it's really at a point where you kind of have to deprogram them. And that's difficult.
I mean, the funny thing is people are talking about Donald like he's Robin Hood, right? He's robbing from the rich and giving to the poor. He's trying to equalize society so that everybody would have food and money and shelter and so on. It's the exact opposite. He's robbing from the poor. He's grifting off the poor to feed his own pocket.
Yeah, that's one of the saddest things. And in the conclusion to my book, I write that the saddest thing is that the people put their trust in these guys and they believe them. Like Trump tells people he loves them. He's using them, of course. He doesn't love them. He despises them. But they only when it's too late, when the country is ruined, do they realize that they were conned, that he's a con artist. They're all con artists. And that's the saddest thing of all. I don't have that much sympathy for these people, but from a human point of view, they put their trust in him and they don't realize that he's going to ruin everything that they loved about the country, that he profoundly hates America. He only loves himself. He's only out for himself. And like all of them are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, it's funny because you use the word that he's conning them, right? And then I want to use that word and tie it into, obviously, January 6th, because any sane person realizes that January 6th was a violent insurrection that has resulted in sending hundreds of people to jail, including some as long as 18-year prison sentences.
Yeah.
Ruth, what will stop the MAGAs from doing something like this again in the future, especially when you have guys like Stuart Rhodes, who's calling Donald a con, who's saying, I was only there because Donald told us to go. So what needs to be done? What more needs to be done to stop these maggots from doing something like a January 6th insurrection, the violent insurrection again?
I mean, more Republicans. The problem is that, Donald acts like a mob boss and he threatens people. And the fact that I'm very, since the time of his impeachments, when, we would read that, senators, like the most powerful people in the country with access to all kinds of security, were crying. They were crying. They were afraid, and this was just the beginning of the threats, where this Congressman, Meyer from Minnesota, I believe, he said, I'm buying body armor, because he was a Republican who voted to impeach Trump the second time. And he said, I put this quote in my book, because our expectation is that someone's going to try and kill us. And I was like, okay, are we in some kind of civil war junta land? Or
Yes.
This is not the America. So that's like a shift in perception. So that was 2021. And now the level of threat to anyone who stands up to him is it's 400%. I think threats against members of Congress are up 400%.
Fuck them. I'm up 2,000%.
But
anytime my name comes up in the press, all of a sudden here it comes again. At least they have DC police. They have they have
that's it. They have access to, but I think that the burden shouldn't be on Democrats to have to deal with this, but Republicans, even those who know secretly that Trump is a nightmare, it's very, very sad that they won't speak out. The worst is Mike Pence. I mean, the guy was targeted for death by his own, and he sat there and raised his hand and said, yes, I will vote for him. I mean, at that point, how do what do you do about these people?
Well, he thinks that Donald will spare his life because he said that.
It's so deluded.
If Donald wins the election, let me be very clear. Mike Pence, gonzo. General Mark Milley, gonzo. And half a dozen other people, right off the rip, gonzo, because Trump will attempt to use and will use powers that do not exist in order to effectuate this end result.
Yeah, the difference is Milley, as a military man, he said publicly that he knows that he'll be on a list. Pence puts up the facade. Even as, he's made some television appearances with his campaign, and he clearly has, body armor underneath his shirts. I notice all these things, living in the heads of these dictators and writing for years about what happens to societies, how they just transform everything into the gutter and everybody into violent thugs. And it's very sad for me to watch this happening and watch the cowardice of so many people. To go back to your question, what do we do? It's just, until the Republicans speak out, and it would have been so easy. The off ramp of the Trump highway to hell was January 7th. And Mike Pence and Mitch McConnell, a couple of them, especially Pence, just could have taken things in a different direction by banding together. That's what you need. You have to have unity against the autocrat. And
Nope.
the fact they didn't do it is really, it's very sad, because that would have finished him off, actually, politically.
Absolutely. So, Ruth, how important do you think it is that the insurrectionists who still remain in Congress be held accountable for their roles in January 6th? This is something that really pisses me the fuck off. I mean, when I tell you I get pissed from it, I mean, I've had members of Congress and I've had conversations with them about it. We know that there are insurrectionists that are members of Congress. Yeah. How did these people manage to get in the day or two before and map out exactly where they were going? Not one member of Congress has been held accountable. It reminds me so much of like the mortgage debacle, that $1 trillion was lost and not one person was held accountable. How likely are any of these folks? How likely are any of them to face any type of consequence?
Well, since we're 3 years into this, and nothing has happened, even as the Mark Meadows and all those other people were indicted as co-conspirators, that was very, very, very important, because it's not enough to have the foot soldiers going to prison. And they're now, I checked the other day, it's over 1,200 people have been arrested. And those were the foot soldiers. But those foot soldiers who are sitting in prison or home arrest, whatever, they don't see the big people paying a price. And many of them know very well that these members of Congress, and they have their networks, and they don't see any justice being done. Now, logically, that should turn them against the whole enterprise. Mm-hmm. But it's very important to have the big fish and to clean Congress of these people. Until we clean Congress of these insurrectionists who are out to destroy democracy, they literally supported an attempt to overthrow the government. I can hardly think of any other country in the world that would still have all these people there. Other places, you go to prison or you're forced into exile immediately, especially places like Brazil that had coups and then had dictatorships. And they responded in a very different way when Bolsonaro had his January 8th. They immediately cracked down on these people because they know what the stakes are.
Yeah, I'll tell you,
we are 3 years later, and nothing has happened to these people.
And I'll tell you, my biggest fear is that, assuming Trump retakes the White House and everything that we're predicting comes to fruition, it becomes a reality that he rewrites the Constitution, confers all power to himself, starts going after people like Mike Pence, like Mark Milley, like the president's CEO of MSNBC, a bunch of, people who have caused him issues, myself, I'm sure, included. He starts going after each and every, and then all of a sudden you have another civil war. There's what? A billion fucking guns in people's homes today. It's not as if, the military, the only ones with these high powered, rifles and so on. I mean, everybody today, is walking around, at least in certain parts of this country, with AR-15s, AK-47. I mean, this is no joke. This is going to be a fucking bloodbath, worse than the Civil War. And that's the part that scares me. But it kind of brought it's on my mind when I've heard you say that 70% of the world's population is under dictatorial rule. I didn't know that until I heard you say it. And that democracy has been declining. But at the same time, people are protesting in very dangerous places like China, right? And Russia.
Yeah.
So are the people, because that goes right to what I was saying, once you lose it and you've tasted it, as we have, you want it back. So are the people living in those oppressed places waking up to the benefits of democracy? And is this going to be what's necessary in order for Americans that are fucking delusional and listening to Trump's horse shit, that this is what's going to be needed?
Well, it could be. But, I'm glad you mentioned all this because, yes, authoritarianism is spreading, but it's also being contested in a new way, and we just don't hear enough about this story. Where it's a huge deal that in Iran there were those protests that went on for months. These brave women, and there were men out there as their allies. Huge deal in China. That's covered up because Chinese don't want us to talk about it. Do you know that these were the lockdown protests? 79 universities had protests in China, including the kind of elite university that Xi Jinping went to. 79. So there are things that are brewing, and I'm tracking these things. And so there's like 10 or 12 countries that in the last years have had either the biggest protests in their entire history or the biggest in decades. And that includes Poland. They succeeded in turning back autocracy, and they had the biggest protests and the biggest voter turnout since 1989. Now, we're actually in this too, because the Women's March, nobody talks about it anymore, in 2017, which was anti-Trump, it was the biggest protest in American history, only to be surpassed by Black Lives Matter in 2020. Do you know that 20 million people went to some kind of Black Lives Matter event, 99% peaceful, multi-generational. There were grandmas there, there were babies, multiracial. So this was like an authentic cross-American movement. So we have that energy, and I think that it can come back again. And we're part of this global desire for freedom.
Can I jump in for 1 second and just,
yeah,
you said that there are 79 universities in China that
had protests.
Do you know how many colleges and universities exist in China? 3,012. 3,012. Yeah. Now, yes, I acknowledge what you're saying, that there is obviously, it's not one, it's not two, it's 79. But when you put that into perspective, Xi Jinping will shut that shit right down. He has no interest in losing his power. And that goes right back into what I was saying, which is this is going to be a fight like this country has never seen before. It's going to make the Civil War look like a minor incursion, because after you start taking away people's rights, you're going to start seeing these whole groups start forming little militia and attacking other Americans it's going to be a bloodbath. Let me put it to you this way. And it's very scary, especially considering Trump doesn't care, as you said, and I've said many, many times, he doesn't care about anyone or anything other than himself. Your life, my life, the average Joe's life doesn't mean anything to him. Give the order. Anybody in the street, with or without a weapon, makes no difference. Gun him down. Something that you would see from a Kim Jong-un, a Xi Jinping, an Orban. That's what you're going to see here.
Well, all the more reason we have to do everything possible to avoid this fate. And I think that I'm hoping that we can build a pro-democracy coalition and get people registered to vote in numbers that will allow us to keep our democracy. But we've got to keep sounding the alarm and getting and being able to reach constituencies that need to hear us.
So what happens then? So Ruth, what happens then when all of a sudden, you're telling people to vote and everybody does vote, and God willing, it's a massive blue tidal wave. Trump's going to come right back out, and he's going to regurgitate what he's been doing the last 3.5 years, which is it's a big lie. They stole the election from us again, and there's still going to be civil unrest. Now, not like the kind that will exist if he gets into power. Then that's a whole nother level. But he will still, as I said, 4 years ago when I testified before the House Oversight Committee, that if Donald Trump loses, there will never be a peaceful transfer of power.
Yeah, you did.
And I'm saying it again. If Trump loses again, he will literally, right after they call it, he will start, which he's already started doing, turn around and say, they're already out there figuring out how to steal the election from us.
They are, and he will. I agree. But that I think that if there's a massive, Democratic victory, I think some people are going to realize maybe they believed him the first time, but now as he's doing it again, it's hard to know, but what would happen. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't. The fact that we know what he's going to do shouldn't lead us to think it's hopeless. Indeed, we should try all the harder, because at the end of this, I think from reading memoirs of people who went through this in different countries, you want to have done everything possible to not give in to some idea that, oh, it's going to be violent, so I shouldn't try. Yeah. That's the message. But you want to know you did what was possible.
Sure. But since we're talking about strongmen, you've said that Benjamin Netanyahu meets all the criteria for being considered a strongman. But strongmen, as you stated, destabilize nations and they weaken the country's defenses. Now, considering Netanyahu's track record and the majority of Israelis who have protested his rule, why can't the people get rid of him? He is just another example of why Donald Trump is doing and saying the things that he's saying. And then there's a second part to this question, because too many folks don't seem to understand that many of us who support Israel, as I do, and I believe you do as well, I support Israel, but I don't support Netanyahu, and I certainly don't support his cronies. So why can't they understand that those two things, they can be true simultaneously? They can exist, but simultaneously. Why have things, tell me if you would, why have things become so black and white on both of these questions?
It's just that people don't like to have their perceptions changed. And I believe that, U.S. policy will need to be adjusted, because Netanyahu he's an autocrat. He's qualitatively different than other people who have been in power. And so he's the playbook where you got to get back into power to shut everything down. So he tried judicial reform, and it's quite extraordinary. I wrote about the protests both for my newsletter and for Haaretz, because they checked all the boxes for successful protests, because they not only kept going and going, and they were giant and they kept growing, but you had what's called the pillars of society. You had CEOs. You had even the head of Mossad was allowing his people to have the time off to go protest. That's incredible in a security state like Israel. So, and now I think the latest poll is, 70% of Israelis want Netanyahu out. And I think it's 30 or 40% want him out now, even though there's the war going on, because he's incompetent and he's interested only in Netanyahu. Yep. And I think there's finally more awareness that these extremist settlers and Ben-Gvir, who's convicted for terrorism, are not serving Israel at all. They're not for peace. They're for kind of imperial annexations. They're for violence. Ben-Gvir is handing out thousands of rifles. This is not the way this is not statesman-like activity. This is thug activity. Yeah. And so we need to revise our perceptions. And some people, they don't want to do that. And this is a situation of emergency, but it's a little bit the same problem where people thought that the GOP they were conservatives. And I'm out there saying, day after day, they're not conservatives anymore. They supported a coup. You've got to change your thinking. And it's just, some people don't want to do that. It's very frustrating.
So, Ruth, the hour goes by very quickly here on Mea Culpa. And I can sit and talk to you for another 10 hours. But my final question to you is, what message should the Democrats be sending to the young voters, to the Hispanic voters, to the Black voters, to get them involved in re-electing President Biden and Vice President Harris? Because I'll be honest with you, you're not seeing, at least I'm not seeing, that people are being very supportive of this administration, despite all of the things that have been accomplished, despite all of the metrics that show that we are doing very well as a country. And forget about comparing it to other countries. We're killing it. But that message is just not being resonated.
No.
What do we need to do?
I mean, the Democrats need way better messaging. And I think we also need a pro-democracy movement that's about not just anti-Trump, but it's about ideals of what America can be, positive content. I think also whatever they're doing is because they're up against Fox, continuously saying their economy's bad, everything's bad. So they've got to readjust their messaging. I also think that they need to use young activists in a much savvier way to reach other young activists and reach young voters. For example, they're still calling people, like people who are in their 20s or less. They don't call, they text.
They don't even have phones.
Yeah.
Other than their cell phones. Nobody has a house phone anymore.
Nobody answers their phone. Right. So they've got to update and redefine their messaging, and they've got to do it fast.
Well, Ruth, thank you so much for joining me. Really great to see you. And definitely going to have to please ask you to come back soon, because there's just so much more for us to be discussing.
Thank you.